the voices of Palestinian children who have had to deal with arrest and detention and sometimes torture at the hands of the Israeli military prison. So at the end of his talk, we're going to have an opportunity to have a question and answer period, and you may be able to buy one of his books. They're going pretty fast, and he will kindly sign one if you like. And I'd like to thank our sponsors. We have 13 sponsors tonight.
All right.
I'm not going to read all of them, but I really appreciate our generous sponsors. And let's just take a moment to thank all of them.
Yeah.
So with that, let's welcome Yousef Aljamal.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
No.
Can you? Okay. So my name is Yousef Aljamal. I grew up in Nusayrat refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. Nusayrat is one of 8 refugee camps in Gaza. It's not the most crowded refugee camp. Compared to Jabalia refugee camp, it's a luxurious refugee camp. So in Nusayrat, we have 85,000 Palestinian refugees, including my family, who live in 9 square kilometers. In Jabalia, 90,000 Palestinians live in 1 square kilometer. So I grew up in this refugee camp. I have some maps with me, but unfortunately, we do not have the converter, so I cannot show them. But I hope that those who know the geography of Palestine and the Gaza Strip can use their imagination as I talk. So Nusayrat is located right in the middle of the Gaza Strip, and I spent my entire life there, except for a few years when I left to pursue my higher education. And in 1948, when my family's village, Aqir, which is 4 kilometers to the south of Ramleh, was completely ethnically cleansed by Zionist militias, and my great-grandfather was killed by the invading forces. His children ended up in the Gaza Strip as refugees. Half of the family ended up in the West Bank. The other half ended up in Gaza, where I grew up. And I have been living in this refugee camp called Nusayrat. I grew up there, and my family is still there. And I'm just giving you some introductions and background because I'll be digging into some stories. Then I will talk about the issue of Palestinian child prisoners, because I think we cannot separate, this experience of Palestinians under occupation. So my mother moved to the Gaza Strip in 1978 when she got married, and her family is still in the West Bank. Okay, so I want to give you an introduction, or a brief introduction about the refugee camp. I attended UNRWA's free network of schools. I am today here speaking thanks to this, network of schools that I attended, and today the U.S. administration decided to completely cut off aid to UNRWA to make the lives of Palestinian refugees even harder. Receiving these services is very essential for Palestinian refugees. We only receive basic services, and unless the issue of Palestinian refugees, or until the issue of Palestinian refugees is resolved, this support should continue, because this support makes sure that Palestinian refugees live in dignity. Again, we do not lead a luxurious life because of this aid, and we do not need it. But again, those who made us refugees should at least be responsible for providing aid for refugees until they go back home and their issue is resettled. We have a number of challenges in Gaza's various refugee camps and everywhere in Gaza, including electricity outages. We have up to 20 hours of electricity outage per day. Israel destroyed the only power plant in the Gaza Strip, which is located in my refugee camp, in 2006, and they bombed the power plant again in 2014, destroying it completely. Fire lasted for 1 week because firefighting teams could not reach to the site, again because of Israeli war jets and drones which were hovering around and targeting Palestinians randomly. Israel also targeted the only sewage treatment facility in the Gaza Strip, which is located right next to the power plant in my refugee camp. And this means that Gaza's municipalities starting dumping sewage into the Mediterranean, which created more pollution in the sea. And the sea is the only place where Palestinians can, have some sort of internment and space. And this also created some skin infections for people who swim in the sea. And as we know that the sea and oceans are not racist as Israel is, and so the waves started carrying, pollution to the north where the Israeli-controlled waters are, and this pushed Israel to finally give permits to some international organizations to build some sewage treatment facilities in the Gaza Strip because they care about themselves and not because they care about Palestinians. Okay. 97% of Gaza's water is unfit for human consumption, and this creates many challenges for Palestinians. Imagine if you are a student having an exam tomorrow, you have to wait for electricity to turn on, or you have to run a generator, and this means that you have to buy fuel, and many Palestinians in Gaza, with the very high unemployment rates in mind, many of these Palestinians cannot afford to buy fuel. And again, if we look at hospitals and how electricity outages affect hospitals, many hospitals run on generators, and the patients at, for example, intensive care units are at the risk of death because of the lack of electricity. Growing up in Gaza as a child, I did not have any place to play, no playgrounds, so very often we play in the streets, dusty streets of the refugee camp, and we could get all sorts of injuries. And we learned survival there. And occupation shaped our lives in many different ways, meaning even if we wanted to play, a game, aside from hide and seek, we would divide ourselves into two groups, the Israeli soldiers group and the Palestinian group. And I used to join the Israeli soldiers group because I used to enjoy beating the hell out of my friends. But again, this is telling how, occupation shapes our lives in many different ways, even when it comes to playing. And if you go to Gaza streets, very often, kids play these games, and very often they carry gun toys, for example, because this is all they, get to see. Drones, guns, and bombing. This is how they grew up. My youngest brother was born in 2006, and ever since, we've been following what's happening in the Gaza Strip, bombing, siege, electricity outages. So he grew up, he's 13 years old now. He grew up in the refugee camp seeing all of this. And again, he's not the only one. So it's an entire generation of Palestinians who went through this trauma, and their lives have been shaped by this trauma. Okay, so I will just touch on some personal stories and then connect them with the book that I'm going to talk about. I think narrating Palestinian stories, personal stories of Palestinians under occupation, is a good strategy to create a counter-Palestinian narrative, because people do relate to personal stories, and it gives Palestinians who are very often, especially in mainstream media, such as in the US, are reduced into numbers and statistics. So narrating Palestinian personal stories give these Palestinians a voice and a face, and it makes people outside relate to their experience in many different ways. Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, and a year before they did, they used to carry out different incursions into various refugee camps in Gaza, starting from 2000, the year the second Palestinian uprising broke out. And in 2004, they invaded Nusayrat refugee camp where my family lives, and they killed 14 Palestinians, including my eldest brother, who was 17 years old. He was left to bleed for 4 hours, and Israeli snipers who were very close to the site of his killing did not allow paramedics to transfer and carry his body to the hospital or to provide any sort of help. The following day, I rushed to the site of his killing. I found his phone on the ground, and when I checked the numbers he was trying to dial as he was bleeding, I found out that he was trying to reach out to the family. But he couldn't, probably because of the Israeli advanced military equipment in the area. So this was not the end of the story. As you know, Palestinians have a lot of kids, and this is a problem for Israel, the demographic threat. And because they cut electricity very often, Palestinians have nothing to do at night except, making babies. So my father made another baby, and 2 years later, I ended up with 2 brothers named Omar. So my parents named my youngest brother also Omar after my eldest brother. So I wrote a story called Omar X, which I contributed to a collection of short stories that was published in the United States in 2014. And the reason I called the story Omar X is because I relate to Malcolm X, and I thought maybe, my youngest brother wouldn't, want this name because it's the name of his eldest brother who was shot dead by Israel. It's like Malcolm X, who was brought into this country as, his ancestors were brought into this country as slaves, and then he was given the name Malcolm. So I find a connection here. I also wrote an article titled Why I Have 2 Brothers Named Omar, which was published by the Electronic Intifada. Another aspect of military occupation in Gaza and the West Bank is the issue of travel restrictions. As I mentioned in the introduction, my mother comes from the West Bank. She was born in Bethlehem, and her extended family lives in different cities in the West Bank, but mostly in Jericho today. And it took her 12 years to get an Israeli permit to see her family. Her parents passed away in 2003, 2008, and she was not able to go to the West Bank and to participate in the funeral procession because of this random Israeli policy of denying Palestinians permits and to allow Palestinians to move freely between Gaza and the West Bank. So I wrote a story about her, plight, trying to get to the West Bank, to her hometown. And the reason, she needed a permit because when she moved to Gaza, she changed her address. So if you are a Palestinian from Gaza, Palestinian from the West Bank, you are treated differently based on the ID you have, or a Palestinian from Jerusalem. Or if you are a Palestinian carrying an Israeli passport, where you get treated as 4th or 5th class citizen. So there are different categories of discrimination and dealing with Palestinians based on the ID they have. So after writing an article about her story, again, these stories, the story of my brother, the story of my mother, and then I will tell more stories, they are not unique in any different, in any way. They are examples of what mostly every single Palestinian family go through. So we got an Israeli human rights organization called Gisha, which means passage, which helps Palestinians move between Gaza and the West Bank to bring her case before the Israeli Supreme Court, and she was granted a 4-day permit to go to the West Bank for the first time. Of course, she overstayed. She stayed there for 32 days a day for every year she spent in Gaza at the time. And again, she was able to come back to Gaza easily because it's easy. If you want to come back to Gaza, it's easy. You just go back, they do not have any problem. But if you want to go to the West Bank, they create all sorts of problems. In 2015, she was given another permit to see her family because her eldest brother passed away. So in some cases, this is not absolute or definite. In some cases, if a Palestinian a first degree Palestinian passes away, Israel would give his or her family permits to participate in the funeral procession. But again, there are many exceptions. She was lucky enough to go there. She got to see her family. And this year she went to Jerusalem twice. She got an Israeli permit because she got breast cancer. And the reason she applied for an Israeli permit to have treatment in Jerusalem is because in Gaza there is no equipped hospital that treats cancer patients, and the only equipped hospital to treat Palestinian patients, whether from Gaza or the West Bank, is located in Jerusalem. It's called Augusta Victoria. So Palestinians have to get an Israeli permit to go there. Again, she was lucky enough to get a permit because there are dozens of Palestinian patients, cancer patients in the Gaza Strip who passed away waiting, for Israel to issue them a permit. In some cases, Israel would issue the permit for Palestinians to have their first chemotherapy session, but not the second one. And in other cases, they would issue permits for Palestinians after they pass away, 2 or 3 weeks after they pass away. And speaking of patients who passed away under siege, my sister Zainab, who was 26 years old in 2007, an UNRWA teacher, she needed a minor surgery which was not available in Gaza, and again she applied for an Israeli permit to go to Jerusalem because the surgery was not available at Gaza's hospitals. And after a week of waiting, she got a rejection, so her health got much worse. She waited another week to get out of the Rafah crossing, which connects Gaza with Egypt, and she had the surgery, but 2 days later she passed away because it was too late for her. And again, she's not the only one. There are hundreds of Palestinians who passed away in Gaza because they were denied permits or because they spent much time waiting for borders to open. In 2014, Israel killed my childhood friend Ayman Shukur while randomly shelling his area where his family lives in Nusayrat refugee camp. He was 25 years old, a graduate of Arabic literature, a smart man, the sense of a human. He was not part of any political or armed group in Gaza, and his only fault was because he was standing on the roof of his family's house when an random Israeli shell hit his body, turning it into pieces. So I document these stories because I think people do relate to these stories, and very often I have these stories with photos of people who were killed, so that people connect to different Palestinian victims under military occupation. And one aspect of military occupation is the issue of Palestinian child prisoners. So I am here in the United States today to promote a book I translated called Dreaming of Freedom, Palestinian Child Prisoners Speak. And speaking of child prisoners, Israel is the only country in the world that systematically prosecutes children before military courts. So they have a system of military courts where they bring Palestinian civilians, including Palestinian children, before military courts. And very often, these children are taken from their families' houses in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. Israeli soldiers would break into Palestinian houses, assault the children, turn the house upside down, and in many cases, if the child is not home, they would take someone else as a hostage, like their parents or their siblings, until these children turn themselves in, and then these children are taken to interrogation centers. They are physically and psychologically assaulted by their jailers and interrogators, and finally forced to sign confessions in Hebrew, a language they do not understand. And I think Israel does this on purpose because they want to create a submissive Palestinian generation. They want to terrify Palestinian children and their families. Otherwise, they would send summons to these families, and families would bring the children to the interrogation centers the next day because they cannot run away. In the West Bank, Israel controls every single inch in the West Bank. But again, they do this on purpose. At any given time, there are 250 Palestinian children in Israeli jails. And UNICEF has reported ill treatment remains widespread, systematic, and institutionalized throughout the process of detaining Palestinian children. Again, in many cases, when Palestinian children are interrogated, their parents, they are interrogated without the presence of their parents or lawyers, in a violation of the Israeli law itself. There is a discrimination against Palestinian children when it comes to age compared to Israeli children who live in illegal Israeli colonies in the West Bank, where Palestinian children are considered, according to Israeli law, those under the age of 16, while Israeli children are considered those under the age of 18. So one of the stories that I documented in the book is of a child called Ayman Abbasi from Jerusalem. He was arrested by Israel in 2015 at the age of 16, and he spent a few months in Israeli jails. Upon his release in 2015, and while participating in a peaceful demonstration in Jerusalem, he was shot dead. And the Israeli forces who shot him dead tried to kidnap his body because they have an established policy of withholding Palestinian dead bodies. They shoot dead so that they could use them in any swap deal with the Palestinians, knowing that the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers are believed to be held in Gaza. They were killed during the 2014 offensive. So they want to exchange them for these 2 soldiers in the future. So the family and neighbors and people who were participating in the protest in Jerusalem rushed his body to the graveyard. Otherwise, it will be kidnapped, and some Palestinians stayed in these numbers graveyards, Israel calls them, for 15 or 20 years. And in many cases, their bodies washed away because of rain or floods, and the records of these graves, numbers of Palestinians were lost. So people had to rush his body to the graveyard, running from one street to another, from one neighborhood to another. But this meant that his family was not able to see him. So he was interviewed for the book, and he did not live long enough to see it published because Israel killed him. And this shows, the systematic and continuous dehumanization of Palestinian children. He was first arrested, then killed, and not only this, they tried to kidnap his body. And I think this shows the importance of documenting personal narratives. His story would have gone unreported, undocumented, but now it's forever in the book, and people can read it. He speaks of torture in Israeli jails, so I will read quickly from his testimony. He says, "I was shocked at the force the Israeli security apparatus used on me at my family's home in Jerusalem's Ras Al Amud neighborhood. The moment I was arrested, I expected to be beaten. However, at the interrogation center, I was hit so badly in the face that when my family saw me at the court, they could barely recognize me because of the marks and bruises." So this is one of the stories. Another story is of Malak al-Khatib, a Palestinian child prisoner. She was 14 years old, going back home from school. She liked some wild flowers, so it was a spring day, and she wanted to pick them up. And once she got to the field, a group of Israeli soldiers stopped her, accusing her of entering a restricted military zone and throwing stones at them. And she, of course, denied all of these charges. She stayed in a prison for 2 months, and she was released. And there is a common thing among these children, whether they spend a month, a week, a year, or some of them were sentenced to 15 years, as we will see. All of them get out of jail with trauma, and they get old really fast in a prison because of the experience they go through. This is her story. She says, "The female prisoners were surprised to see me, but they could understand from their experience how a child simply walking among the roses could be arrested. I spent about 2 months with them. I was released and my heart was still full of sorrow, not because I was arrested, but rather because of the injustice Palestinians are still facing. I still have so much sorrow in my heart because the darkness in our lives has not yet come to an end. And we, the victims, are still struggling on the path to freedom. The last story, not the last individual story is of a child from Hebron called Yazan Sharbati. Yazan lives on Shohada Street, Martyrs Street in Hebron, which is a segregated street, and maybe some of you have been to Hebron and you've seen how this road is divided between Palestinians and Israeli settlers, where Palestinians are not allowed to cross to the Israeli side, and settlers who live on this road are known to be thugs and violent. And they throw stones, rocks, bottles, garbage, whatever they find at Palestinians who live in the area in an attempt to drive them outside their houses. So, and Palestinians who live there have to build a sort of protection so that they could protect themselves from the garbage and stones thrown at them. And even if international solidarity activists go there to show support for these Palestinians, they get attacked and they receive the same treatment Palestinians receive. So he was going back home, walking on Shohada Street, when a group of Israeli settlers, and there is a famous photo of an Israeli settler throwing a wine bottle at a Palestinian woman in this street. It's available online. He was attacked by a group of Israeli settlers, and the Israeli army immediately came and arrested him. Instead of arresting those who assaulted him, he was taken to interrogation and he was released a few days later. This is his story. He describes Israeli settlers and soldiers who live in the area. They scream at us and beat us. All of this disturbs the tranquility of our lives from the day we come into this world. Arresting me without committing any crime gave me more determination to continue to exist here. I still live in my family's house, in my street, in my little neighborhood. I will never leave, he says. Okay, so I will conclude with this story. So there's a village in the West Bank called Haris, and there was a car accident nearby this village. There is a street that is only exclusively used by Israeli soldiers and settlers. Palestinians are not allowed to drive in this street, and it's a bypass road surrounding the village. So a car accident took place between an Israeli truck and an Israeli car, and this resulted in the serious injury of 3 Israeli settlers. The initial testimony of the truck driver was that the car accident was a result of a flat tire. But again, he changed his testimony at the military court, saying that a group of Palestinian children who live in the nearby village of Haris threw stones at him, which resulted in the car accident. This was not proved by any independent sources, and again, the Israeli military judge took his testimony for granted. Israeli soldiers broke into the village and they arrested 5 children from the village aged 12, 13, and 14, and they were sentenced to 15 years in jail. They are still in jail. Okay, so 2 last remarks. Another aspect of military occupation and arresting these children is the issue of house arrest. So many of these children get arrested again and then again, but there is also another aspect of detaining these children, which is called house arrest. So these children are sentenced to 6 or 8 months under house arrest. They are not allowed to leave, and again, Israel does this on purpose, because when these children are arrested by Israel, the fight is between them as an oppressed people and their jailers, their oppressors, Israeli oppressors. But when they are placed under house arrest, the fight becomes between the children and their families, and their families want to make sure that they do not violate the terms of their release. So they make sure that they do not leave the house, and these children want to go to school, want to play with their friends in the street. So this again destroys the fabric of Palestinian families. Change, we are here to bring about change, and there is a bill. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. There is a bill in the House of Representatives introduced by Representative Yeti Markullah, which calls for making sure that U.S. aid and tax money given to any country in the world is not used to detain or arrest children in general, including U.S. aid given to Israel that is partially used to arrest Palestinian children. So far, there are 21 co-sponsors for this bill, and I think one way to bring about change when it comes to the issue of Palestinian child prisoners is to get your Congress people to sign into this bill. So please make sure that you write to your Congress people, you contact them, you call them, and get them on board to support this bill. Because, I think the issue of Palestine is always controversial in the United States. And even, I think all of you agree with me that protecting children and making sure that they are at schools rather than military courts and prisons is not a controversial issue, but again, it's still a controversial issue in this country. But this should not stop us, and we should make sure that our Congress people as American citizens sign into this bill. Okay, I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to your questions and reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yousef, for your talk. And we will have the opportunity to have question and answers like we talked about before. And before we do that, we want to raise money for this event. And my colleague Rod Such is going to collect your donations. So please do give generously. As some of the stuff you're talking about sounds like, as you mentioned, ethnic cleansing and just trying to crush an entire population. And I wonder, do you have any sense of what Israel's end game is? I'm guessing they're not working, it doesn't sound like a nation that's working toward peace. What do you think their ultimate plan is if they have one?
I think, so when the US, Israel always mention, they speak of shared values. And there are two types of settler colonial projects in the world. Complete settler colonial projects, like in Australia and other countries, and incomplete settler colonial projects, like what is happening in Palestine, and what happened, for example, in New Zealand. So Israel's ultimate goal is to erase Palestinians completely. They want the land without its people, and they will continue to do this. They did not finish the job in 1948, so they tried to finish the job in 1967. And they are continuing their campaign of ethnic cleansing against Palestinians. Ethnic cleansing doesn't have to be, for example, destroying villages. This is one way to do it. But for example, cutting electricity